Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. The U.S. Israeli military operation in Iran has begun little over a month ago with no resolution in sight so far. Yet, as the war continues to send ripples across the global economy, there is a risk that we may have already passed the threshold beyond which the looming specter of recession could become all too real. Today, we speak to the author of a chilling economic forecast which outlines the severe impact of a prolonged conflict, Gábor Scheiring, Assistant Professor of Comparative Politics at Georgetown University in Qatar. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning, everyone.
So your article does make for a rather disturbing read, no matter where in the world you are, I have to admit. Would you say that the first deadline for actually avoiding a severe economic impact has already been passed? Do you think we're heading for an inevitable economic catastrophe?
I mean, the first deadline based on all of the available economic modeling was around end of March, and we are beyond that already. So it means that the best case scenario was that the Strait of Hormuz reopens from April, oil and gas starts to flow. That would have meant a few percentage points of like 0.5 percentage point of GDP slowdown and say around 1 percentage points increase in inflation. This is where we are now. So that was the optimistic scenario, and we are living this right now. The issue is that there is no end in sight for this conflict, as you've just said. So Trump keeps on saying all kinds of contradictory remarks about the goals and the end deadlines. So the latest ones are again 2 weeks from now on. But even if the war ends in the next 2 weeks, the Hormuz Strait won't reopen immediately. Iran is in control of the strait, so it requires some kind of either unprecedented concentrated military effort with dubious outcomes, or I think the real solution would be only diplomatic, and that takes time. So I think now the next optimistic scenario is that the strait reopens from May. That is still kind of a very painful scenario in terms of inflation and GDP based on the current modeling. It would add a few percentage points of cost in terms of higher inflation and lower GDP growth around the world, including Europe, but we're not in a major stagflation crisis.
Before we consider the ramifications, right, because it already does sound rather disturbing from an economic perspective. But first, let's get one thing out of the way. Can Iran itself and its economy in particular, survive the prolonged conflict and the prolonged closure of the strait? Because Iran isn't making any profits on oil either, right?
I mean, Iran has, in fact, in the first few weeks when there were data available, managed to actually increase its oil exports compared to February. So Iran controls the strait and is able to get shipment through, has special arrangement with China as well. So it's hard to track. These are shadow fleets. But so far, Iran has been less hit than most other countries around the world. So we have to keep that in mind. And then there is gas as well, right? So both around 20% of the global oil and gas supply goes through the Strait of Hormuz. 30% of global helium supply, a very large part of global fertilizer supply, around 30% of global aluminum supply outside China comes from the Gulf region. So we're not just talking about oil, we're talking about a range of key products that are currently shut off and will create an inflationary perfect storm if the strait remains closed. And again, there is hardly any military solution for that. Now the U.S. talks about just leaving the scene and then let other countries figure the situation out. So that is a prolonged crisis. And again, this is if this continues until June, then we are not anymore talking about a linear increase in prices and drop in GDP, but that's an exponential worsening of the situation from June on. That's when strategic oil reserves in major economies across Europe will run dry. That's when the gas refilling season really kicks in Europe. So that's when major economies are going to scramble. That's when strategic rationing will kick in, transportation, industrial plants will have to temporarily halt if the crisis goes on. So that's really a major global stagflationary crisis, the one that we last saw in the 1970s.
So now, you've mentioned that Iran has actually been able to make some profit, assuming that the US does not escalate and does not attack Iranian oil facilities, which they said for the time being they're not doing because they want their economy to be able to rebuild following the war. Of course, this could change. But now there is also another beneficiary whom you've mentioned in your article, and that is Russia. Can you tell us more about how Putin is leveraging this crisis for his own benefit?
I mean, yeah, that's one of the perverse outcomes of this conflict, because the U.S. has lifted the sanctions on Russian oil. That means Russia is now able to not only sell oil globally, but is also able to reap the extra profit from increased prices. So Russian oil prices were depressed before the conflict because of the sanctions. So even the small amounts that was able to sell was forced to sell at lower prices. Now it's not only able to sell more oil, it's able to sell it at an increased profit. So Russia is able to refill some of its war chests. Now the explosion of these key Russian oil plant, a refinery, was a major blow. So that's another factor. But if you just look at the Middle East crisis, then Russia is perversely one of the biggest beneficiaries financially of this conflict.
Is that the only danger associated with Russia? What about the potential temptation which could appear among European countries if the crisis goes on, if it becomes worse, and Moscow says, well, we do have a solution? Do you think that any governments might actually respond to this sort of key dangling on the part of Vladimir Putin, who could try to leverage this aspect of the crisis as well?
I mean, Putin will keep on pushing for that, and as we all know, he has some allies within the European Union to amplify his voice. I'm talking about Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who at least until April 12th still has power. But so far, European leaders have rejected any softening on their stance on Russia, so they're holding the line for now. But again, European oil reserves will continue being depleted until the Strait is not reopened, and they will be forced to make some really tough choices. So then we'll have to have this conversation again, and that could perversely again benefit Russia if Europe doesn't find any other solution to this problem. I think it's in Europe's interest as well to push hard back against the U.S. and Israel and make them stop this war, not just for basic humanitarian and political reasons, but also it's in the very economic interests of Europe as well.
Speaking of economic interests, does the United States have the capacity to actually make up for the shortages on the European market? I'm talking both about oil and about LNG. There have been signals that American LNG producers are already actually ready to reap the windfall. But what about capacity? Will the US simply say, well, we would like to fulfill this demand, but we simply do not have the ability to do so for the time being?
I mean, we have to also differentiate between different time scopes, right? So in the short run, yes, you can find some supply from the U.S. and European, American fossil companies are benefiting from this. But it's just not possible to find an extra 20% gas supply. That's just not doable in the short run. So what we're talking about is a really long-term crisis, especially in the case of gas. 20% of global supply comes from Qatar. Europe only imported fairly little from Qatar, but gas prices are set really globally. So it's not really the short-term supply bottleneck that matters here, but it's the prices as we go into the gas refilling season throughout summer. By October, Europe is mandated to have its gas reserve up to 80%. And there will be a massive competition for available gas supplies, including American, Norwegian gas supply. Asian economies, all the world will compete for the same supply, with Qatar's supply being out. And mind you, it's not just that the strait is closed and Qatar is not able to ship its gas through that. It's also the fact that Ras Laffan has been hit. That is the major LNG infrastructure in Qatar, and it has lost its up to around 20% of its capacity. So even if the strait is reopened, a part of the global supply will remain out of the market for the next 3 to 5 years, according to Qatari official estimates. So it's certain that we can price in a significant gas price increase, even if the war stops and the strait reopens.
Now, let's address the elephant in the room, which you've hinted at in your article, namely the possible indirect effects on Europe and other regions from a crisis in the Global South. From what you said, the Global South is even more exposed to all that volatility. There is a risk of hunger in many of the countries that were dependent on fertilizers going through the Strait of Hormuz. And then you also have Asian economies actually feeling the strain of those supply bottlenecks already. Do you think that this could be, like, the hidden cost of the crisis hitting us indirectly?
That is very true. I mean, the biggest victims of this are going to be, or are already, various countries around the Global South. We've seen Philippines among the first introducing rationing, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka. Economies around the ocean states across the Pacific are highly dependent on imported fossil fuel, and their economies are very, very vulnerable to these price shocks. Across Africa, the non-oil and gas exporting countries are going to be hit and are already hit in a major way. Fertilizer impacting food prices is going to cause, not just this year, especially next year, as we're heading into the long-term effects of reduced supply and increased fertilizer prices. Will likely create increased hunger in the most vulnerable countries. Major macroeconomic imbalances in the already vulnerable economies of the Global South is very likely to happen. And of course, if you look at the Middle East, you have many countries that are also financially and economically vulnerable. Iraq in very bad situation. So of course, that will also put pressure on local populations to seek a better future elsewhere.
So it could be a migration risk, and unfortunately we're going to have to park our conversation here. Still, thank you very much for joining us. Gábor Scheiring was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Jonasz. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.